place in the plan of God. So, where do we first meet Abraham in the Bible? All right, he was living in Ur, which would be in the region near Babylon. Who was his father? His father's name was Terah. All right? His father's name was Terah. And so the first place we find that Abraham is called. You go back there and twiddle your thumb.
Let's bring this all back with you. You can tell me whatever sounds good.
All right. Are you pulling it down on the wireless one?
I'm trying from the wireless and the floor mics, even in general.
Oh, I ain't even thought about them. With the wireless and then the floor mics picking up the wireless. Yeah. Larry's been trying to get everything adjusted, so we got to readjust. We had a lot of issues back there that Larry's got fixed for us this week, but now we got to get all the sound things readjusted. Just right. All right. So, the first place we find that Abraham is called is in Ur. But he left Ur and he went where? All right, when he left Ur, he went to Haran. All right, so he left Ur, he comes up through Mesopotamia, he makes it to Haran. And he stayed there for a while, and then God called him again, and that's when he started making his move down into the land of Canaan. You give Ann one?
No, I'm coming.
She went to the ladies' retreat this weekend, and she is give out.
Can't get it together. Sleeping on that bunk. I mean, this side, I stayed on this side all night.
And she went to bed early last night. She couldn't hardly walk.
Since when did you sleep when you go to camp?
Well, we went to bed late, and we actually slept in Saturday morning. I had Cecilia come in. Who's in charge of fixing the coffee? I said, I am. Well, I need some coffee. I had been on my walk already. I said, I'm coming.
All right. So, what was Abraham's name originally? Abram. Anybody know what Abram means? All right. Abram means father. Okay? But God changed his name to Abraham, which means what?
Father of nations.
Father of a multitude. Okay? So, just a name change is part of God's promise to him that he's going to have many descendants. Now, how old was Abraham when God called him? 75 years old. All right? And he doesn't have any children at 75 years old. And God says, you're going to be the father of a multitude. Think about the faith that Abraham had to have. I think you're good right there. All right. Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you. You're my tech guy. All right. So, but think about the faith he had to have. He doesn't have any children. He's 75 years old. God says you're going to be the father of a multitude. And yet he believed that's an important thing about him. Abraham marks the time when God starts to fulfill the prophecy from Genesis 3:15 about the seed. Remember, the seed would crush the head of Satan. And now we get into Abraham. It's Abraham's seed is going to be the one that crushes the head of the serpent. All right, so God's plan is starting to unfold with Abraham. Abraham lived in a time when people were steeped heavily in idolatry. Abraham's father was very involved in idolatry. Joshua 24:2 tells us that. All right? And so it's with Abraham now that God begins particular dealings with one people to the exclusion of all other people. For what purpose? All right, but he starts dealing with one people. That would be the Hebrew people, because Abraham is the father of Hebrew people. He starts dealing with one group of people to bring about special revelation and Jesus. All right? You see, that's the problem the Jews had. The Jews had the idea God dealt with one group of people. That was them. Everybody else was excluded. That wasn't God's purpose. God's purpose for the Jews was for special revelation and to bring Jesus into this world. He had to have a group of people for that purpose. And so he did that. But throughout the Old Testament, he tells the Jews to let the Gentiles know what he's taught them. But they like to keep it to themselves. And not share it with the Jews, because the Gentiles were unclean. You know, they couldn't have any dealings with them, according to the Jews. All right? Okay. But even when God selected one group of people for special revelation, did he ignore the Gentiles? No. Acts chapter 14. Somebody read verses 16 to 17.
In the past he let all nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their season. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy.
Okay. So God let them go their ways, but he didn't stop showing his kindness. He didn't stop giving witness to the fact that he is. And it's still the same way today. The people that do not believe in God, he's still giving that witness, right? They all get the rain, they all get the food, they all get the different things God has always given to all people. But he wants everybody to know there's more to it than that, and his special revelation. So, let's start with Abraham, thinking about Abraham's faithfulness. Abraham's faithfulness. Would somebody read Acts chapter 7, verses 2 through 3? Threw you off, didn't it?
Yes, I heard. I was hearing the feedback again.
Oh, you're hearing that again?
At 7.
Acts chapter 7, verses 2 and 3.
To this he replied, brothers and fathers, listen to me. The Father of the glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Macedonia, before he lived in Haran. Leave your country and your people, God said, and go to the land I will show you.
All right, so that's Stephen's account of what took place in Genesis chapter 12, in verse 1, of Abraham being called to go to the land that he was going to show him. All right, so somebody read Hebrews 11:8.
Faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going.
All right, so Abraham heard God, he obeyed God, had no clue where he was going, just set out on the journey following where God was going to lead him. That in itself would take a lot of faith. You still here?
A little bit, but I think I'm understanding the problem more on why.
Okay.
The speakers are moved in a different location, so they're closer to the floor mics. Because they used to be next to the flags.
Yeah.
Right. We need to move them before church time.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah, because we were trying to get other stuff from last week back in place, and they didn't get moved, so we'll do that. Okay. But God made another promise to Abraham. All right? Somebody read Genesis 15 and verse 5.
He took him outside and said, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be.
All right. Now remember, Abraham's already old. And God's saying your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars, if you could count them. Because we can't count the stars. All right? Another time he told them they're going to be like the sand on the beach. We definitely can't count the sand on the beach. We all know that. So he's going to have all these numerous descendants. Okay? Somebody read verse 6.
Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness.
All right. Abraham believed the Lord and credited to him as righteousness. In his old age, he believed he was going to have that many descendants. So many you can't count them. Well, it's true now. There are so many descendants of Abraham you can't count them. All right? So, you got that promise, which God fulfilled. Now, what was the sign of the covenant God made with Abraham?
Circumcision.
Circumcision. In Genesis chapter 15, is Abraham circumcised?
I don't think so.
No, he's not.
Abraham didn't get circumcised until he already.
99.
We're in chapter 15 here. Chapter 17, he's going to get circumcised. All right. Why is that significant?
Because of the fact that it shows that God cares about the circumcised as well as the uncircumcised at that point in time. But then he said to be circumcised And that's compared to our obedience to be
In baptism, yeah. All right.
Everlasting covenant.
All right, so Abraham believed God before the covenant really has gone into effect with him. Okay? All right, because really the whole covenant doesn't go into effect until chapter 17. All right? Let's go to Genesis 17. All right, so chapter 17 opens. Abraham is now 99 years old. Does he have that promised first son yet? No. Not the promised one. All right, Ishmael's been born, but that wasn't the promised child. All right? All right, so God says to Abraham, walk before me and be blameless, and I will establish my covenant, and I will multiply you exceedingly. And Abraham fell on his face, and God continued saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. And no longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude. All right, and so it comes on down, and they talk about this covenant a little bit more. And God says that God basically says Sarah's going to have a child. And Abraham said, oh, let Ishmael be the son. And God said, no, Sarah is going to have a child. All right? And verse 17, Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 99 years old, bear a child? God said, Sarah will give you a son, and you shall name him Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him, an everlasting covenant for his descendants. And so the sign of the covenant was circumcision. So Abraham took Ishmael, and they were circumcised. All right?
That's where I was trying to go with that, what I was saying a while ago. Abraham and his son Ishmael were both circumcised on that very day.
Yeah, they were circumcised the same day. And all the men in the household were circumcised at that point. All right. So the promise is you're going to have all these children. Abraham laughed. Sarah laughed.
The God laughed last. Ha, I told you.
Yeah, God got his laugh in too, because she did have the son. It took a lot of faith to believe that those things were going to happen, but they did. Now, when we come to Genesis chapter 22, we find something very interesting, and that is, God says, okay, I want you to take Isaac, and I want you to go up on the mountain where I'm going to show you to go, and I want you to sacrifice Isaac. Did Abraham hesitate? No. Packed up what they needed and went. And I think it's about verse 5 in Genesis 22 that always amazes me. Abraham looked at his servants and said, we are going to go up on the mountain and we will return. He had faith. And Hebrews chapter 11 tells us that Abraham reasoned that even if he did kill Isaac, God would raise him from the dead. Right, so think of the faith that he had to have to leave his people and go somewhere God told him to go that he didn't have a clue where he was going or what kind of people would be there. Faith that he was going to have a child when he was 100 years old, and he did. And now, maybe 12 years or so later, God says, I want you to sacrifice that son. And Abraham was willing to do everything God said because of his faith.
And apparently he kept it to himself. He didn't even, we know he didn't tell Isaac.
Right.
Because Isaac wanted to know what the sacrifice was. And, he probably didn't tell Sarah either, because she would have raised a fuss. Thinking myself.
Yeah, he may not have told everybody this is what God said. He just packed up and went. And he was willing to do everything God said. Tremendous amount of faith when you think about all the things God put him through. But now let's think about the promises concerning his physical descendants. All right? The promises concerning his physical descendants. So, Genesis chapter 12. Let's go back and look at that first calling. And would somebody look at verse 2? Read that for us.
And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing.
All right. So, first of all, I will make you a great nation. Now, a great nation, what nation was that? The Hebrews. The Hebrews, all right? And that was through Jacob. That's the one great nation. But God also had promised him he was going to be the father of many nations. Can you name at least two?
Ishmaelites.
All right, the Ishmaelites. Because Ishmael was his son. The Ishmaelites, basically the people we call Arabs today.
Midianites.
Yeah, Midianites, Ishmaelites, all end up becoming what we call the Arabs. Can you think of another nation? Well, we got the Hebrew nation. That comes through Jacob.
Ashurites, the Tessites, and
All right.
the Levites.
Yeah, you're reading all them hard names. I was just thinking of one more. Jacob had a brother. What was his brother's name? Esau. Esau was the father of the Edomites. All right? So, and then you got all those other names that Nathaniel's reading off, because Abraham had many sons, not just the two. All right? So there were numerous nations, but the nation that God was concerned about was the Hebrew nation. All right? He promised him land. Somebody read verse 7.
The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him.
Okay? So the Lord said, I'm going to give you this land. Later, when Lot separated from Abraham, in chapter 13, God told Abraham, said, look, lift up your eyes and look. Look to the north, look to the south, look to the east, look to the west. Everything you can see, I'm going to give to you. All right? But he also made a promise concerning Abraham's friends and enemies. Somebody read Genesis 12:3, just the first line.
I will bless those who bless you,
Well, go ahead and read the next line.
and whoever curses you, I will curse.
Okay? So that's the promise to his friends and enemies. I'll bless the ones that are good to you. I'll curse the ones that are not good to you. All right? So there was that promise. But then there's another promise, and it's the promise involving the Messiah. All right? Somebody read that last phrase in verse 3.
All people on the earth will be blessed through you.
All right? All people of the earth will be blessed through you. In Genesis 22:18, after he was obedient about his willingness to sacrifice Isaac for him, in 22:18 it says, all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring because you have obeyed my voice. All right? So, somebody go to Galatians 3:14 and read that for us.
He redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit.
Okay. All right. So, the blessing of Abraham can come to the Gentiles through Jesus. All right? Galatians 3:16 says this, now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his offspring. He didn't say descendants as of many, but as of one, to your offspring, which is Christ. All right, so Abraham's seed is Christ, that one descendant that we're looking for that can save everybody. So that's his physical descendants. And so even if you were to look in the genealogy in Matthew, you know, it kind of breaks it down from Abraham to David, from David to Jesus. All right, so the emphasis of that spiritual line, that physical descent that comes from Abraham. But is that all of the descendants that Abraham has, those physical descendants?
No.
No, because Abraham has spiritual descendants as well. Now, we already mentioned that the Jews thought they were it. You know.
Ray, my grandfather's brothers were David, Obed, and Jesse.
Oh.
And my grandfather was George, so I don't know. They ran out.
Yeah, I guess they did. The Jews made too big of a deal about being Abraham's descendants. When you look at the preaching of John the Baptist in Matthew 3:9, it says, don't think to yourselves, we have Abraham for our father. For I tell you, God is able to raise up children to Abraham from these stones. All right, so John was pretty hard on them about their Jewish heritage. In fact, in Matthew 3:10, he says, even now the axe lies at the root of the trees. Therefore, every tree that doesn't produce good fruit is cut down and cast into the fire. So John's saying, you can't claim Abraham as your father if you're not living like Abraham. And he's even telling that to the Jews. When Jesus is talking about, or talking to the Jews in John chapter 8, and he told them that they would know the truth and the truth would set you free, their response in verse 33 was, we are Abraham's offspring and have never been in bondage to anyone. How do you say we'll be made free? Well, number one, their statement's wrong. They had been in bondage. All right? But more importantly, it's not just the Egyptian bondage. They were in bondage to sin and didn't realize it.
And it also proves the fact that no matter who you're kin to or what your line of relatives are, it's up to the individual to do individual belief in living.
Okay, yeah, it is. I remember, you said that made me think. I remember one time Larry and I were out visiting. We stopped and talked to this one guy. And we just basically asked him, you know, are you a Christian? And he said, yeah. And we said, well, what makes you a Christian? He said, because my parents are buried in this church cemetery, and he named the place where they were buried. That's what made him a Christian. You know, a lot to learn about the Bible.
Or my parents were a member of such and such a church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just because, I mean, the same thing is, as it applies where God says that everyone's responsible for their own sins. And we've talked about those verses a lot. So, if you're responsible for your own sins, you're responsible for your own faith. And that's a job parents have to do is help the child develop their faith to the point it's no longer their parents' faith, but now it's their faith. And why they need to believe the things that they believe. All right. So, Abraham has physical descendants, but he also has spiritual descendants. The verses that we started out with this morning. He is not a Jew who is one outwardly, and neither is circumcision that which is of the flesh. But he's a Jew who is one inwardly, and the circumcision is in the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God. So who are the spiritual descendants of Abraham?
Christians.
Christians.
Faith.
Somebody read Galatians 3:26 through 29.
For you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who were baptized in Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free man. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to promise.
Okay. So anyone who belongs to Christ is Abraham's offspring and heirs according to the promise. The promise God made to Abraham way back in Genesis chapter 12. We are part of that promise. We are part of his descendants. So Christians are scattered throughout the world. And they all belong to Abraham through Christ, because we belong to Christ. Okay? Now, I asked you a while ago why it was significant that it says Abraham believed God and was credited to him as righteousness before he was circumcised. Okay? So let's go back and dwell on that just a little bit more and to think about it a little bit more. Would somebody read Romans 4:1 through 3?
What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, discovered in this matter? If in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness.
Okay. So that last verse, verse 3, is a quote from Genesis 15:6. So what is Paul saying here about circumcision?
That's a fleshly thing.
It was a thing of the flesh. All right? So, was Abraham justified by what he did in the flesh? Was Abraham justified by his works? No. Same thing is true today. Can we be justified by works? No, we can never work enough to earn our way into heaven. Okay? So we can't be justified by works. So, the question then is, how do we obtain that state of righteousness with God that we all want? So would somebody keep reading in Romans chapter 4, this time pick up at verse 9 and read through verse 12.
Is this blessedness only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? We have been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him in righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised? It was not after, but before. And he received circumcision as a sign, a seal of the righteousness that he had obtained while he was still uncircumcised. So then he is the father of all who believe but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness might be credited to them.
Through verse 12.
And he is then also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised, but also follow in the footsteps of faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised.
All right. So, why is it significant that it says that Abraham was credited as righteous before circumcision?
Because he believed.
Right? He believed. So, if Gentiles believe, can they be justified? If Jews believe, could they be justified? It's a matter of faith. Okay? It's a matter of faith. Now, so Abraham believed, and Paul in his journeys, has he gone out preaching and teaching? Who was he preaching and teaching to? Gentiles, mostly. He would go to the Jews first, and most of the time they rejected him, and then he'd go to the Gentiles, and he'd preach, and they would believe. But because they had faith, they could be Abraham's offspring. All right? So that's what Paul's saying here. So somebody pick up again at verse 13 and read through 18.
It was not through law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be the heir of the world, but through righteousness that comes by faith. For those who live by law are heirs, faith has no value, and the promise is worthless, because law brings wrath, and where there is no law, there is no transgression. Therefore, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of faith of Abraham. He is father of us all, as it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. He is our Father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead, and calls things that are not as though they were. Against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so became the father of many nations, just as it has been said to him, so shall your offspring be.
Okay. So, it wasn't by law that people were saved. You know, the Jews were sticklers in the law. But because they were such sticklers in the law, they found a lot of loopholes. At least they thought they did. And could work the law to their benefit. Was the law doing them any good that way? No. All the law could really do is define what sin is. It really didn't have any kind of power to save us. But faith, like the faith of Abraham, does have the power to save us. All right? So, We've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. In that state of sin, there's no hope of acceptance with God on a personal basis. We need some help. That help comes through Christ because He's Abraham's offspring that the promise was made about. And so we have to listen to Christ and we have to obey Christ. Not the law, but the grace that comes through Christ that produces the faith that works to our obedience in following what God would have us to do. So, Abraham occupies a very important place in the plan of God because of that. Because his faith is the example of the kind of faith that we need. All right. Questions or comments? What time is it?